Everything changed the day Mark, my husband's son, arrived at our home. What began as a simple family gesture soon turned into a whirlwind of emotions, secrets, and choices I could never take back. Between stolen glances, an undeniable tension, and the unexpected intervention of Olivia, my husband's sister, my life took a turn I never saw coming. Hello there. I'm not sure how you found your way here, but I do know one thing. You won't be leaving anytime soon. This story is different. It will make you feel, think, and yearn for things you never imagined. Get ready, because your emotions might just spiral out of control. My life was like a calm river until the day Mark called his father. My name is Rachel, a 50-year-old homemaker in Boston. I'm married to Henry, a hardworking man who owns a logistics company and spends more time on the road than at home. When Henry told me that Mark needed a place to stay after his divorce, I agreed without much thought. After all, he was his son. What could go wrong? When Mark arrived, I was caught off guard. I hadn't seen him in years, and the young man I remembered had become someone entirely different. Tall, confident, with a gaze that seemed to see right through me. "Thanks for having me, Rachel," he said, flashing a smile that stirred an unfamiliar restlessness inside me. I didn't realize then that his arrival would mark the beginning of something I could never undo. Mark wasted no time settling in. His presence was strong, filling every corner of the house effortlessly. That night, during dinner, he spoke about his divorce with a calmness that surprised me. It was as if the weight of the situation didn't affect him at all. As he talked, I found myself watching him. His gestures, the steady cadence of his voice, the way his eyes met mine when he answered my questions. "You have a different air about you, Mark," I said without thinking. He smiled. "And you haven't changed at all, Rachel. You're just as elegant as ever." A seemingly innocent phrase, yet it left a mark on me. With Henry away most of the time, the atmosphere at home began to shift. The next morning, as I rearranged some furniture, Mark was in the kitchen making breakfast when I asked for his help. "Can you give me a hand with this cabinet? It's heavier than it looks." He agreed without hesitation, coming over immediately. As we pushed together, our hands brushed. Just a fleeting contact, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. When we finished, I noticed his gaze lingering on me, intense, as if trying to decipher something. "Thanks for your help," I said, attempting to sound natural. But something inside me had already changed. That night, sleep evaded me. I could feel his presence in the room next door, and though I tried to ignore it, thoughts of him crept into my mind. I got up for a glass of water, and as I passed the hallway, I heard soft music coming from his room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him sitting on the bed, writing in a notebook. He looked so focused, so detached from the world, that I felt like an intruder just watching him, but I couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about him, something pulling me in against my better judgment. I quickly walked away, but that image of him stayed with me. Days passed, and yet the tension between us only grew stronger. One afternoon, as Mark was working out in the backyard, I stepped outside with a glass of lemonade. He was shirtless, and sweat traced every defined muscle of his body. When I offered him the glass, our eyes locked once more. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, his voice carrying a tone that left me breathless. My cheeks flushed and I hurried back inside, but deep down I knew this wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening between us, something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. That night, as I cleaned the kitchen, Mark walked in to grab something from the fridge. "Need any help?" he asked, stepping closer than necessary. "No need, I'm almost done," I replied, but he didn't move. His presence lingered behind me, his warmth unsettling. It was difficult to focus. When I finished, I turned to say something, but his eyes met mine, unwavering. "Rachel, I really appreciate everything you've done for me," he said softly. For a moment, time seemed to pause, but before I could respond, he stepped away with a knowing smile. That night, it became clear. The boundary between what was right and what was forbidden was beginning to blur. Do you feel it? The tension is just beginning, and what comes next will change everything. If this has captivated you, comment your thoughts and subscribe now. I promise what's ahead will keep you on the edge of your seat. Later that afternoon, while I was tidying the living room, Olivia, Henry's sister, called. "I'm stopping by for a visit. It's been ages since we've had a good chat," she said excitedly. Her visits weren't unusual, but something in her tone made me feel this one would be different. By the time she arrived, Mark was home. He opened the door just as Olivia stepped inside. "Mark, you've grown so much I almost didn't recognize you," she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug that lingered a couple of seconds too long. He smiled, slightly uncomfortable, yet as charming as ever. From that moment, I sensed the atmosphere shifting in an indescribable way. After the greetings, we settled into the living room. Olivia always carried herself with confidence, but today she seemed particularly at ease. As we talked, she directed comments at Mark that, on the surface, seemed innocent, but carried undertones I couldn't ignore. "It's incredible how much you've changed, Mark. You must be driving the women at your gym wild," she said, her gaze fixed on him. He chuckled modestly, shifting in his seat, clearly flattered but uneasy under her attention. I attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Olivia continued, dropping subtle remarks that maintained the charged air in the room. Eventually, she suggested opening a bottle of wine. "It's been so long since we've had a proper family evening," she said, pouring the glasses. Nervous but not wanting to seem out of place, I agreed. Mark accepted his glass with a smile. As we drank, the conversation turned more personal, more intimate. Olivia had a knack for steering topics into uncomfortable yet captivating territory. At one point, she turned to Mark directly. "How do you handle so much attention from your clients?" He laughed, attempting to deflect, but Olivia pressed on. "With that body, I wouldn't be surprised if many of them wanted more than just your training advice," Olivia said with a smirk. Mark responded with a casual laugh, but I caught the way his eyes flickered toward mine, as if measuring my reaction. Words began to mix with glances, and the room seemed to shrink around us. Olivia stood from the couch and moved to sit beside Mark. "It's incredible how life changes people," she murmured, placing a hand on his shoulder. Mark looked momentarily surprised, but didn't pull away. From the other side of the room, I tried to lighten the mood. "Olivia, always so direct," I said with a nervous smile, but she wasn't about to stop. She turned to me and extended a hand. Rachel, come here. I don't bite. I approached slowly, keeping my composure. Sitting down on Mark's other side, I noticed his expression shift. Caught between us, confused, intrigued, and maybe even a little tempted. The air thickened, becoming intimate, almost suffocating. Olivia, ever confident, began joking. Rachel and I have always known how to share things, haven't we? Her words struck a chord deep within me, igniting something I'd been holding back for too long. I didn't even realize when I gave in, but my body moved toward them on its own, my breathing quickening, my thoughts clouded by desire. My heart pounded like a drum as I reached the couch. Olivia smirked mischievously and leaned in to kiss Mark, her lips soft but filled with challenge. He returned the kiss, but his gaze flickered to me. When I sat beside him, the brief touch of my hand on his was enough to make him turn to me. In that instant, the barriers between us shattered. Our lips met with a wild intensity, something neither of us had ever known before. It was primal, unrestrained, a release of everything we had been holding back. Mark's hands roamed my body urgently while Olivia, exuding confidence, orchestrated each touch. The living room, once the setting for countless family gatherings, became a chaotic symphony of tangled bodies. Mark's hands explored every inch of skin they found, my back arching as his lips grazed my neck. The sensation was heightened by Olivia's touch, adding an unexpected layer of intensity. The rhythm was frenetic and raw, each movement driven by an urgency that felt unstoppable. Every sound, every kiss was a silent confession, a testament to the fact that we were surrendering entirely to something forbidden, something irreversible. After that night, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The morning brought an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. Over breakfast, as we sipped our coffee, Olivia's discomfort became evident. Her words were carefully chosen, her gaze avoiding both mine and Mark's. "I think I'll stay at a hotel next time I visit Boston," she said with a nervous laugh that barely concealed her unease. I simply nodded, trying to maintain my composure, but inside I knew she was grappling with something she couldn't handle. Mark, on the other hand, seemed more at ease than ever, his confidence only growing since that night. Later that afternoon, as I was organizing boxes in the garage, Olivia approached me. "Rachel, can we talk?" she asked, her tone serious, her face a mixture of conflicting emotions. I set down the box I was holding and turned to her. "Of course." She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know how that happened," she admitted, shaking her head. "It was intense, but I can't get it out of my mind. This is wrong, Rachel. I can't keep coming here as if nothing happened." A lump formed in my throat. I understood exactly what she meant. The weight of what had transpired between us, between Mark, was pressing down on both of us. "I know," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do either." Olivia sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We crossed a line, and we can't take it back." Silence stretched between us, heavy and unresolved. We both knew that what had happened couldn't be undone, but neither of us had the courage to say what came next. What did this mean for us, for Mark, for the tangled, forbidden connection that had drawn us together so recklessly. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. Olivia's words were a whirlwind of guilt and regret, yet laced with an undercurrent of unresolved desire. I tried to calm her. Olivia, what happened was out of the ordinary, but it doesn't have to define us. We can leave it behind. But even as I spoke, I knew my words were hollow. Nothing about that night could be erased. While Olivia wrestled with her guilt, Mark seemed resolute, determined to relive what had transpired. That evening, after dinner, he found me in the kitchen washing dishes. "Rachel, can we talk?" he asked, stepping closer with a look I had come to recognize. I set aside what I was doing and followed him into the living room. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his words bold and unwavering. His honesty hit me like a thunderbolt. For a moment I stood in silence, searching for a response that wouldn't come. "Mark, this can't keep happening," I said, trying to sound firm. But with the confidence he had grown into, he stepped closer. "You know this isn't just physical," he said, his voice steady. "I feel it every time we're near each other." His words made me falter again. The next day, Olivia decided to leave earlier than planned. "Thank you for everything, Rachel," she said, giving me a quick hug. Her eyes were full of emotion, but she didn't say anything more. Mark saw her off with a smile, as if everything was perfectly fine, but I knew Olivia wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. Her departure left a void in the house, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. It felt as though her absence gave Mark more freedom to approach me without the weight of her presence. That night, as I sat in the living room with a book, Mark walked in and sat beside me. "Rachel, I know you're struggling with this, but I need you to hear me," he said, his tone more serious than usual. His sincerity was disarming. "I don't know how to explain it, but since I've been here, I feel something I've never felt before. I don't want this to end." His words were a mix of confession and plea. Still trying to hold myself together, I replied, "Mark, this has to stop. Henry trusts us. This would ruin everything." Yet even as I spoke, I could feel my resolve crumbling. That same night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door to my room creaked open slowly, and there he was. Mark. With a look that spoke more than words ever could. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered. I didn't respond. I stayed silent, caught between desire and guilt. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood beside my bed. "Just tell me to leave and I will," he said, his voice soft but resolute. But those words never left my lips. Instead, I let him come closer, and in that moment, I knew I had crossed the line once again. My body had made its decision long before my mind could catch up. I didn't stop him as he moved closer. I could feel his warmth even before he touched me, and when his hands cupped my face, the world ceased to exist. The first touch of his lips was a spark, igniting something uncontrollable within me. His mouth moved with a mix of urgency and tenderness, unraveling every defense I had left. I surrendered completely, my hands instinctively seeking his body, feeling the hard contours of his muscles beneath my fingers. That night, every inhibition, every barrier we had struggled to maintain crumbled into nothing. Mark didn't take long to let passion take control. His hands roamed my skin, gliding along my neck and down with a firm touch that sent shivers through me. When he lowered me onto the bed, the weight of his body pressed against mine, trapping me in a pleasure I had no desire to escape. His mouth explored every inch of my skin with a devotion that left me breathless. His hands were strong and deliberate, each caress setting me ablaze. I couldn't hold back the sounds escaping my lips as his rhythm grew hungrier, more intense. When our bodies finally became one, it was as if everything we had suppressed erupted at once. There was no hesitation, only the consuming desire that overtook us. My breath mingled with his, each movement drawing responses from me that I couldn't control. In that moment, nothing else existed. His body pressed against mine, his hands tracing every inch of my skin, his whispers brushing against my ears. It was wild and freeing, a whirlwind I never wanted to escape. What would you have done in my place? Subscribe, because this isn't the end. The inevitable has only just begun. A few days later, Henry returned from his trip, exhausted but in good spirits. His smile filled the house with a sense of calm that felt almost cruel. I couldn't look at him without feeling the weight pressing on my chest. As he talked about work and the new contracts he was negotiating, all I could think about was what had happened in his absence. "Is Mark settling in well?" he asked sincerely. I nodded, forcing myself to stay composed. Mark, sitting casually on the living room couch, answered smoothly, "Yeah, everything's great, Dad. Thanks for letting me stay here." His tone was so natural that, for a moment, I wondered if he was handling this secret far better than I was. Has Olivia called since she left? Weeks passed without a word until I received a message. "Rachel, I can't keep going like this. I've decided to move away for a while. I need to clear my head." I stared at the text, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. I knew her departure was an escape, but I also understood that she had no other choice. When I told Henry that Olivia had decided to move, he seemed surprised but didn't ask too many questions. "She's always been impulsive," he said, brushing the topic aside. Mark, however, didn't say a word, but I noticed how his expression hardened briefly upon hearing the news. That night, Mark sought me out again, just as he had done so many times before. "I'm looking for a place to move soon," he said as he sat next to me on the couch. His words caught me off guard. "Well, so soon? I thought you'd stay a little longer," I replied, unable to hide the surprise in my voice. He looked at me with that intensity one could never ignore. "You know I can't stay here, Rachel. This is getting too complicated, and I don't want to make things harder for you." His honesty left me speechless. For a moment, I wanted to beg him to stay, but I knew he was right. I knew his leaving was inevitable, but I wasn't ready to let him go. That night, when I heard the familiar footsteps in the hallway, I knew it would be the last time. The door opened slowly, and there he was, staring at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce through my very being. His voice, deep and heavy with emotion, broke the silence. "This'll be the last time," he said. I didn't respond. His words were a painful reminder that this moment was as inevitable as it was fleeting. He stepped closer and I let him. His warmth enveloped me, and as his lips met mine, the weight of all the emotions I had suppressed over the weeks erupted between us. The kiss was more passionate than ever, as if we both understood that every second mattered. His hands, firm and deliberate, explored my body, leaving no inch untouched, as if he were committing it all to memory. His breath grew heavier as he leaned over me, gently lowering me onto the bed. His tenderness contrasted with the urgency of his movements. My hand sought his, our fingers briefly intertwining before his caresses resumed their path across my skin. His lips left mine, trailing down my neck and collarbone, leaving a blazing trail of heat and desire that made my back arch. Every touch, every movement was infused with a mix of passion and farewell, as if his body was saying everything his words couldn't. When we became one, the world around us disappeared. The rhythm was deep, a desperate dance that blended the intensity of desire with the sorrow of knowing it was the last time. Every glance, every muffled moan was a silent promise that this moment would live within us long after it ended. When it was over, silence hung between us, thick with everything left unsaid. The next morning, Henry left early for work, blissfully unaware of what had unfolded in his own home. As I watched him go, I felt trapped between two worlds, the one I shared with him and the secret one I had built with his son. Once Henry was gone, I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Mark came down the stairs with a suitcase in hand. "It's time for me to go," he said, with a calmness that hurt more than I had expected. I walked him to the door. Before leaving, he turned to look at me one last time. "Thank you for everything, Rachel. And never forget it." The house felt larger and emptier after Mark left. Henry carried on with his routine, oblivious to everything, while I struggled to fill the void his son had left behind. Days dragged on, but every corner of the house reminded me of him. Even though I knew what we had done was dangerous, part of me couldn't help but miss him. Olivia didn't return either. It was as if they had both decided to erase this chapter from their lives, while I was left with the memories and the consequences of everything that had happened. If you've made it this far, I want you to know you are special. If this story made you feel something unique, leave a comment with your deepest thoughts. I want to read them. And subscribe right now, because there will always be stories that make you desire more.